It's Monday, April 11th. With us this hour, we have managing editor of Bloomberg Politics, John Heilemann, chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University, Eddie Glaude Jr., in Washington, staff writer at the Weekly Standard, Michael Warren, and in Nashville, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Jon Meacham. Good to have you all on board this hour.
So, Mr. Meacham, we start with you. This past hour, we talked about a disconnect between the establishment and voters. And also about how the system to many Americans seems rigged. And we showed the Democratic votes that showed Bernie Sanders winning a caucus 56 to 44%, and then showed that it was actually Hillary Clinton that got the most delegates by a good bit because of the superdelegates. And then we have Donald Trump on the other side, running away with victories in states like South Carolina, and then their headlines saying, well, these delegates have been flipped and turned to actually vote against the will of the people that went to the voting booths. And we understand these are the rules. We understand this is the system that's set up. We understand that Donald Trump complaining about that could be classified as whining. But doesn't this just play into Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump's argument that the system is, in fact, rigged?
Absolutely. The gulf between, the establishment or the experienced political class and the voters. Now, let's remember, these are people who are actually voting and responding to polls. So there's at least a certain level of engagement there. There's probably a whole nother group that's even more disenchanted, who's not bothering to vote, who's not bothering to be registered in polls. But it's as profound as any time I can remember, certainly going back to the 19th century, where people just don't have faith in traditional political institutions to deliver on the central promise of American life, which was that we may not have equality of outcome, but we're supposed to have equality of opportunity. And there's a fundamental disconnect in the country that's been driving our politics now for a long time in a subtle way, and probably really since last June or so, when Trump got involved, it became the central organizing principle of our politics.
And Eddie, we've been told by the smart guys and the smart women that as the process moved along, Americans would become more mature and they would move to establishment candidates. And yet, on the Republican side, you have Donald Trump up by 25, 30% in New York and Pennsylvania. And on the Democratic side, Bernie Sanders just won his eighth contest in a row. His eighth contest in a row.
Right. I think this is a reflection of an overall cynicism, not only about the political process, but about the state of American life. I mean, we look at that big piece in the Washington Post today about the new divide in America with regards to death. So the consequences of things being rigged is not just simply in terms of the political process, in terms of delegate counts.
There's a pretty stunning article in the Post.
It's an extraordinary article, right, where we see American white women dying earlier. We've seen my colleagues at Princeton talking about, Annie Case talking about American white men without high school educations dying earlier. We already know
their life expectancy for less educated white men is actually shortening, and now this Washington Post article shows the same things happening
for white women.
For white women.
And we already know that African American men and women are dying earlier. And what's interesting is that this is not a matter of just mortality, it's also a matter of morbidity, right? Yeah. That is to say that there's just overall, just the quality of life is deteriorating. So when we talk about things being rigged, we're not just talking about the political process, not talking about just delegate counts. We're talking about the effects of the new economy on the quality of life of Americans across the board. So this is not about a matter of maturing and then siding with the political class.
Right.
This is about these are opinions that reflect people's day-to-day lives.
An economy that we've been talking about, Mika, here for years now. That is getting more and more disconnected with working class, middle class Americans, and the stat that we've used at least for 3 or 4 years that in real dollars, average wages have declined since 1973. Since 1973.
Well, and over the past decade, data has come out, especially recently, that our children, the next generation, will not do as well as this one, and that's new as well. That's depressing.
And that's what's driving.
That's not America.
We ask, what's driving the Bernie crowds? What's driving the Trump crowds? I think this answers the question.
Right here.
There's not an establishment in the country that's in good odor with the vast majority of people in the country, whether it's the political establishment, the business establishment, the financial establishment, the media establishment, the religious establishment, all of it, for the last 20 years, the sense of the establishment not representing the views of the vast majority of Americans has been growing, and it's finally tipped over to the point where the leading presidential candidate on the Republican side and the candidate on the Democratic side who has been driving the argument, although he's still slightly behind, are now the candidates who are giving voice to that profound and sweeping sense of frustration with establishments that do not represent the views of most people.
Right. And I would argue that it's not just a sense, it's a reality.
Oh, absolutely.
It is the data.
Absolutely.
It is the numbers.
And we have to ask ourselves, what is the vision of the world that will emerge from this sense of precarity, to use a big academic word, Joe? This sense of precariousness.
I'm going to write that one down.
It's a big academic word. I don't even know what it means.
This sense of precariousness, right?
I went back to college.
Yeah, precarity, right?
Well, you remember yesterday we were eating, and I said there seems to be, because my sandwich was falling apart, I said, a bit of a precarity to this ham sandwich.
There's a sense of precarity that's
there's a sense of precarity to this ham sandwich.
When I got
to it was falling apart.
Yeah.
But seriously, though, folks are making political decisions, right, based upon their sense that life isn't what it seems to be, or what it's supposed to be.
That's what Mika and I saw up in New Hampshire, and we tried to explain this a couple of times.
Oh, at the Trump rally.
We went to a Trump rally in New Hampshire, and when we walked out and started looking around, we weren't looking at Donald Trump on stage. We were looking at the people.
Right.
The 3,000, 4,000 people that came out in a snowstorm, trying to figure out, just looking at their faces, why did they come out in the middle of a snowstorm, pack this place to watch this billionaire speak? And it was a lot of working class Americans, as I always said, looked like, they put on some jackets that they, probably hadn't worn in 20 years because they felt that's what they were supposed to do, and they went out. And you see a different crowd, a younger crowd, going out to the Bernie crowds.
Responding to language that many people in the political establishment would say, you can't go out in a run for president on the basis of calling for a political revolution every day. That's the core of Bernie Sanders' message. He says revolution in every speech, and he is drawing crowds, as we all know, of many thousands of people with whom the message of revolution is resonant with them. That is the kind of language that would have been considered dangerous or just too far in our political system, in the mainstream of our political system, just a couple cycles ago. Now he is the most, apart from Donald Trump, he's the candidate, actually more than Trump, in terms of consistently now drawing crowds that are 8,000, 10,000, 14,000.
18,000.
They hear revolution, and they come.
And here's Bernie Sanders over the weekend talking about why voters really need to think about who they vote for. Take a look.
The point that I was making, which is absolutely correct, is that if you look at where she is getting her money from, Wall Street and other powerful special interests, she voted for the war. She cited Henry Kissinger, in a sense, as a model for her. I think those issues will tell the American people that in many respects, she may have the experience to be president of the United States. No one can argue that. But in terms of a judgment, something is clearly lacking.
And what I said is that a candidate like Secretary Clinton, who voted for the disastrous war in Iraq, who has supported virtually every disastrous trade agreement, which has cost us millions of decent-paying jobs, and who receives incredible amounts of money. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars through a super PAC from every special interest that you can think of, and from the billionaire class, I have my doubts about what kind of president she would make.
Is that fair?
Well, I think, one way to read it is that there's a sense in which something follows from her ideology, right? What would follow from her commitments? How will it address, right, what we've been talking about all morning, the fact that everything seems rigged? Or is this simply the status quo? Voting for Hillary Clinton, will this be doubling down, right, on what has happened and what continues to happen? And I think what Bernie Sanders represents and what we see around the excitement around his campaign is a battle over the soul of the Democratic Party. And I think the challenge of those young folk to Bill Clinton in Philadelphia, his so-called mea culpa at Penn State, right? All of this is really about, right, challenging, right, the direction of the Democratic Party, trying to insist that it actually upholds the most vulnerable, that it defends the most vulnerable in our society.
And John Meacham, for all of the, look at those people, show the crowds, for all of the people that are out there coming to these events. Again, whether it's on the Democratic side with Bernie Sanders or the Republican side with Donald Trump, it is an outright rejection of the Bush-Clinton era that we have been in now for a quarter of a century, where they feel like the system is rigged. Bill Clinton.
Enough, they say.
It doesn't matter whether it's Bill Clinton or George W. Bush or even Barack Obama. They know if a trade deal comes up, it doesn't matter what they said in the campaigns. Bill Clinton always talked about human rights abuses in China. Got elected, he started doing business immediately, just like George H.W. Bush with China. You know, Barack Obama. You always know that on free trade, the presidents are going to all go to one position. At the end of the day, on war, they usually move to the same position. Most people feel, again, like the system is rigged, and I just wonder, you've been predicting the breakup of the 150-year duopoly between the Republicans and the Democrats in this country. Are we seeing that right now? Is it coming apart at the seams?
Well, certainly ideologically, intellectually, and even emotionally, I think the parties are cracking up. Now, whether structurally that follows because of the stranglehold that the established parties have on things as fundamental as ballot access is a longer story. But we wouldn't be having this conversation with this level of specificity and indeed passion if there weren't stresses and strains on this. The parties have not really changed in a fundamental way since the mid-'60s and the battles over civil rights. And right now, there is, particularly in the Republican Party, but also in the Democratic Party, there's not a majority consensus about globalization and its impact. And parties begin to reconfigure, realign when there is not a majority consensus about the central issue of our time, whether it was the Whigs and slavery in the 19th century or civil rights in the middle of the 20th century, and now globalization. And I just, when senators say, it's hard to imagine two more different accents in American life than Ross Perot and Bernie Sanders, but there's a pretty close in their messaging. When I hear Senator Sanders say things like, I know I don't have experience, but the question may be one of judgment. Remember Ross Perot's best line in many ways in 1992, which was not dissimilar in representing a discomfort with globalization, was, no, I don't have experience running up a $2 trillion debt. And these messages are resonating in part, not just emotionally, but intellectually too.
All right, new polls show Donald Trump with a large lead over his opponents in two of the states up next for voting. In New York, a Fox News poll shows Trump leading by 32 points, 54% to John Kasich's 22%, Ted Cruz at 15%. And in Pennsylvania, Trump has a 26-point advantage ahead of Kasich, 48% to 22%, Cruz in third at 20%.